Gary, step over here, please.
Excuse me, what is this
The
about?
$9.4 million you raised from 71 investors through a fund that never placed a single dollar in any actual investment for
9 years, Gary Prokop was the church deacon his own congregation trusted with their retirement savings. He was also running a fund that never actually existed.
I have managed this community savings for
9 years of bank records show.
He would not get the chance to explain away one more delayed withdrawal before Minnesota securities examiners had already confirmed no such registered fund existed under his advisory license at all. Within weeks, forensic accountants would trace 9 years of a textbook Ponzi structure. 71 investors and $9.4 million raised into a fund that, by the time it collapsed, held $380,000 against $9.4 million owed. Nearly all of it came from people who knew him from the same church pew, the same hockey rink bleachers, the same small town where his word had never once needed a second signature to be believed. A lake cabin bought with investor money, a daughter's college tuition paid the same way, client statements generated by nobody but himself on his own spreadsheet for 9 straight years. A retired schoolteacher's simple question to a state regulator was the only thing that finally cracked 9 years open. What began as one quiet decision to cover a private loss with other people's trust would end with a federal jury in Minnesota hearing exactly how a deacon had spent nearly a decade running a fund that never actually existed. I need you to sit with this one for a second before we keep going. His investors were retired teachers and factory workers sitting next to him in church every Sunday. If that makes you as angry as it makes me, say so in the comments and subscribe. These stories matter. Gary Wendell Prokop was born in 1967 in St. Cloud, Minnesota, and grew up in nearby Sauk Rapids, the only son of one of the few black families in a small central Minnesota town of roughly 14,000 people. His father worked for over 2 decades at a paper mill along the Mississippi River that ran through town, and his mother taught 4th grade at a Sauk Rapids elementary school for nearly as long, both of them active members of Redeemer Lutheran Church, a congregation that had welcomed the Prokop family warmly enough decades earlier, that Gary grew up genuinely believing the church was where his family's real standing in the community had been built, more than anywhere else. He graduated from Sauk Rapids Rice High School in 1985 and enrolled at St. Cloud State University, studying finance, one of a small number of black students on campus at the time, and worked summers at a regional insurance agency in town that gave him his first real exposure to the mechanics of retirement accounts, annuities, and long-term savings products. Professors later recalled him as unusually comfortable presenting to a room, a natural warmth that classmates said made him seem trustworthy almost immediately, long before he had any actual credentials to justify that impression. After graduating in 1989, he spent the next 15 years building a career in financial services, first as an agent at that same regional insurance firm, then, by the late 1990s, as a licensed representative at a small, independent brokerage serving central Minnesota's smaller towns. A market larger firms in the Twin Cities rarely bothered courting closely. In 2005, at 38 years old, Prokop struck out on his own, registering as an independent investment advisor and opening Prokop Wealth Advisory out of a modest storefront office on Sauk Rapids' main commercial street, betting that nearly 2 decades of relationships built through church, youth hockey, and simple small-town familiarity would translate into a client base loyal enough to sustain a one-man practice. The bet paid off steadily. Within a few years, he was managing retirement and savings accounts for dozens of families who had known him, in many cases since he was a boy singing in the church choir. He married his wife, Denise, in 1993, and they raised 2 daughters in Sauk Rapids, both of whom played youth hockey, a sport Gary himself began coaching in 2008 and continued for well over a decade, eventually taking on a head coaching role for one of the town's more competitive youth teams. He was ordained a deacon at Redeemer Lutheran in 2011, a role that involved leading portions of Sunday services visiting homebound and ill congregation members, and, informally, serving as a trusted source of practical advice, financial and otherwise, for a congregation that had watched him grow up among them. By his mid-40s, Gary Prokop occupied a specific and unusually powerful position in Sauk Rapids, simultaneously the town's most trusted financial advisor, a hockey coach whose players' parents saw him several nights a week, and a church deacon whose spiritual role gave his financial advice an implicit credibility that went well beyond anything his actual licensing represented. Clients routinely described feeling that doing independent due diligence on Gary's investment recommendations would have been not just unnecessary, but genuinely rude. A small but telling detail that would matter enormously once regulators began reconstructing how his fund had operated for so long without a single complaint. His personal finances, however, had taken a serious hit in 2014, when a real estate investment he'd made personally, a commercial property purchase outside his advisory practice entirely, collapsed after an anchor tenant defaulted and the property sat vacant far longer than he'd projected, leaving Prokop personally underwater by a sum he found genuinely difficult to absorb without visibly damaging. The image of steady, unshakable financial competence his entire client base, and frankly, his entire identity in the community, depended on. Therefore, in 2015, 19 years into a finance career built entirely on being the one person in Sauk Rapids nobody thought to question, Gary Prokop began quietly soliciting a handful of his closest, most trusting clients into a new, informally structured investment opportunity, a decision born less from any grand criminal ambition and more from an urgent, private need to make a personal financial hole disappear before anyone in his church or his hockey rink ever had reason to notice it existed. Minnesota, like most states, requires investment advisors to register with the state's Department of Commerce Securities Division and to hold any pooled investment fund they manage to specific disclosure, custody, and reporting requirements designed to protect investors from exactly the kind of informal, unverified arrangement Prokop was about to build. Legitimate pooled investment funds are typically required to use an independent third-party custodian to hold investor assets separately from the advisor's own control, and an independent fund administrator to generate client statements. Structural safeguards specifically designed to prevent an advisor from simply fabricating both the fund's holdings and its performance reports himself. Prokop's Opportunity Fund used none of these safeguards. It existed nowhere in Minnesota's registered investment vehicle database, was never disclosed to the state as a pooled fund requiring separate oversight. And Prokop generated every client statement himself, using a personal spreadsheet template rather than any independent administrator, meaning the only record any investor ever saw of their money's supposed performance came directly from the same person whose personal financial future depended on that performance, appearing consistently strong. Minnesota's Department of Commerce, like most state securities regulators, relies heavily on investor complaints and periodic routine advisory examinations to surface this kind of unregistered activity. Since the sheer number of small, independent advisory practices operating across the state makes proactive, comprehensive auditing of every advisor's side activities logistically impossible with the department's available staffing. In a town of 14,000 people, where Prokop's 19 years of clean regulatory history as an advisor was itself treated as sufficient proof of trustworthiness, none of his investors, nearly all of whom had come to him through church, hockey, or a direct personal referral from someone in one of those two circles, felt any particular need to verify the fund's registration status independently, a step that, had any single one of them taken it early on, would have immediately revealed the fund did not legally exist in the form Prokop had described it. That system, built on nearly 2 decades of personal trust substituting entirely for institutional verification, worked exactly as intended for 9 years. It also meant that once Prokop decided to begin using new investor deposits to quietly cover his own losses, the specific community trust that had built his practice in the first place became the exact mechanism that let the fraud expand for as long as it did. The fund's mechanics were, once forensic examiners finally reconstructed them, almost entirely conventional as far as Ponzi structures go. Prokop described the Opportunity Fund to prospective investors as a private real estate and small business lending vehicle, promising steady annual returns of 9 to 12%. A figure well above what any legitimate low-risk fund could reliably deliver, but plausible enough. In a town where Prokop's word carried the weight it did, that almost nobody pushed back on the number itself. New investor deposits, rather than being placed in any actual real estate or small business lending vehicle, were used directly to pay the promised returns owed to earlier investors, a structure that critically produced exactly the kind of consistent, on-time statements that made the fund appear to be performing precisely as promised for years at a stretch. Early investors, mostly older congregation members and longtime hockey coaching friends, received their promised statements reliably and, on the occasions they requested smaller withdrawals, received those too without issue. A track record that did more to spread the fund's reputation informally through word of mouth than any marketing Prokop could have paid for. Because Prokop restricted the investor list almost entirely to people who already knew him personally, the fund's growth followed the exact social geometry of his own life. New investors arriving through a hockey parent's recommendation, a fellow church member's quiet suggestion after Bible study, a retired neighbor mentioning at a 4th of July gathering that Gary had something special available if you asked him directly. By 2019, the fund had grown enough that Prokop used a portion of investor deposits to purchase a lake cabin, wiring the down payment directly from the fund's operating account, and, in the years that followed, used additional fund money to help cover his younger daughter's college tuition, both expenses that, to anyone reviewing his outward lifestyle, looked entirely consistent with the successful, stable financial advisor Sauk Rapids had always known him to be. Over 9 years, the fund grew to 71 investors and approximately $9.4 million raised, with an estimated $6.1 million of that total never invested in anything at all, split between paying earlier investors their promised returns and funding Prokop's own personal expenses. By the time the fund collapsed, it held roughly $380,000 in actual liquid assets against $9.4 million it legally owed its investors. Several of the fund's largest individual investors were, investigators later confirmed, retired teachers and factory workers who had rolled over the bulk of their pension savings into the Opportunity Fund specifically because Prokop had managed their more conventional retirement accounts responsibly for years beforehand. A track record that made the newer, higher return fund feel like a natural next step from someone who had already earned their complete confidence. In February 2024, a wave of investors, several of them recently retired and hoping to withdraw larger lump sums to cover planned expenses, began encountering repeated delays and shifting explanations from Prokop about processing times, a pattern that had simply never occurred during the fund's earlier years when withdrawal requests tended to be smaller and considerably less frequent. One investor, a retired schoolteacher and fellow Redeemer Lutheran congregation member who had grown suspicious after a third consecutive delay with no clear resolution, contacted the Minnesota Department of Commerce's Securities Division directly, asking a simple, direct question: whether Prokop's fund was properly registered with the state at all. The answer came back within days. No such registered investment vehicle existed under Prokop's advisory license, a discovery that prompted the Department of Commerce to open a formal investigation almost immediately and issue an emergency cease and desist order within weeks, freezing what remained of the fund's assets before any additional investors could be drawn in, or existing investors further exposed. A forensic accounting of the fund's bank records, once subpoenaed by state examiners, revealed a textbook Ponzi cash flow pattern spanning the fund's entire 9-year history. Incoming investor deposits paid out directly to other investors as returns within days of arriving, with no corresponding outgoing transactions to any actual real estate purchase, business loan, or legitimate investment account anywhere in the records at all. Examiners specifically flagged the client's statements themselves as a red flag that, in hindsight, should have been apparent far earlier, generated entirely by Prokop himself using a personal spreadsheet template rather than any independent fund administrator or custodian, a structural absence that any thorough registered advisory review should have caught, but had gone unchecked for years given Prokop's otherwise clean 19-year regulatory history and the fund's small, informal scale. Prokop's longtime office assistant, interviewed as part of the investigation, described being instructed to tell inquiring investors that withdrawal delays reflected the fund being in a strong growth position that simply needed 60 to 90 days to properly liquidate. A script she said she had used with dozens of worried callers over the years without ever understanding it wasn't true, believing, as she later told investigators, that she was simply relaying normal fund administration language rather than actively participating in a cover story. Investigators also recovered emails from 2019 between Prokop and the seller of his lake cabin, showing the down payment had been wired directly from the fund's operating account rather than from any personal account. Financial documentation that removed any ambiguity about whether investor money had funded Prokop's personal lifestyle rather than any legitimate investment activity. Examiners noted the cabin purchase occurred during a period when Prokop's outward advisory income from his legitimate, separately managed client accounts would not plausibly have supported a purchase of that size. A discrepancy that, once flagged, made the underlying fund records considerably easier to characterize definitively as fraud rather than mismanagement. The smoking gun was the combination of the 9-year bank record pattern and the self-generated client statements together. Money moving in a closed loop from new investors to old ones, with no outside investment anywhere in the trail, dressed up in official-looking statements that had never once passed through anyone but Prokop himself. On March 18, 2024, at 10:30 in the morning, FBI Minneapolis field office agents and a Minnesota Department of Commerce investigator approached Prokop at his Sauk Rapids storefront office as he prepared for a scheduled client meeting. Gary Prokop. "We have a warrant related to the Opportunity Fund," the lead agent said. Prokop set down a folder of client paperwork, his expression composed. "I've spent 19 years building this practice on trust and integrity. Whatever you think you've found, I'd encourage you to talk to any one of my clients about the man they know me to be. We've confirmed the fund was never registered with the state, and the fund's bank records show new deposits paying out old investors directly." His voice stayed measured, almost pastoral. "I have prayed over every decision I've made for this community. I would never knowingly put a single member of my church in harm's way. Your lake cabin was purchased with investor money, Mr. Prokop. That's not a matter of intent. That's a matter of the bank records." For the first time, something in his composure gave slightly. "Every dollar I ever used, I fully intended to replace. I never once believed I was taking anything from anyone permanently. 71 investors are missing $9 million right now." He didn't answer that one. He looked down at the folder still sitting on his desk, his hands trembling faintly for the first time since the agents had walked in. "I need to call my attorney," he said quietly. "And I need to call my wife." He was placed in handcuffs in the same storefront office where, for 19 years, clients had walked in trusting him with their retirement, at 10:41 that morning, 3 blocks from the church where he had led Sunday service the week before. The sentencing includes a statement from a woman who sat next to him in the same church pew for over a decade. Stay for that part, and subscribe if you want more of these every week. Federal prosecutors in the District of Minnesota charged Prokop with securities fraud, wire fraud, investment advisor fraud under the Minnesota Securities Act, and theft by swindle, with parallel state charges filed in Benton County District Court. A federal grand jury returned the indictment in June 2024, facing the 9-year bank record pattern, the self-generated statements, his office assistant's testimony, and the lake cabin wire transfer documentation. Prokop pleaded guilty to all federal and state charges in September 2024 rather than proceed to trial. At sentencing, the retired schoolteacher, whose simple question to state regulators had first exposed the fraud, addressed the court. "I sat next to that man in the same pew for over a decade," she said. "I trusted him with my retirement the same way I trusted him to lead us in prayer on a Sunday morning. I still don't fully understand how somebody holds both of those things at once, faith and fraud, and lives inside both of them for 9 years without either one stopping him." The court sentenced Prokop to 12 years in federal prison and ordered $6.1 million in restitution to the 71 defrauded investors. The Minnesota Department of Commerce permanently revoked his investment advisor registration and imposed a lifetime bar from the securities industry under a consent order, closing off the only profession he had built his adult life around. Asa Gregory Halvorsen, who prosecuted the case, noted at sentencing that the 9-year duration of the scheme was itself evidence of how completely Prokop's community standing had insulated him from scrutiny. Since a fraud operating this openly in a larger, less trusting market would very likely have been caught within a fraction of that time, Redeemer Lutheran Church removed Prokop from his role as deacon following his arrest, and several of the fund's investors, including members of his own former congregation, ultimately recovered only a fraction of their retirement savings through the ongoing federal restitution process, a process officials estimated would take years to fully resolve. He led prayer on Sunday and ran a fraud the rest of the week for 9 straight years. The case waiting on the right-hand side proves trust this deep never needed a single lie to look convincing. It just needed time.